Iran just told Trump something no foreign government has said out loud in years. Don't call defeat a deal. 5 words, delivered publicly, directly at the President of the United States. And the world heard it. This is not a diplomatic disagreement happening behind closed doors. This is Iran's leadership standing in front of cameras, naming Trump by name and telling him that whatever he is selling to the American public as a negotiation victory is, in their words, a humiliation dressed up as diplomacy. When a country under the weight of crippling sanctions, military threats, and international isolation still refuses to let a sitting American president frame the narrative, something significant has shifted. Hit that subscribe button right now because this story is going to reshape the entire conversation around American foreign policy in the Middle East, and you will not want to miss a single update. So, what exactly pushed Iran to go this public, this boldly, at this particular moment? The answer requires understanding something that most cable news coverage skips entirely. The geopolitical pressure Iran has been absorbing for the past 18 months, and why, despite all of it, Tehran has concluded that silence is now more dangerous than confrontation. According to senior Iranian officials and regional analysts who have been tracking the back channel communications, the breaking point came not from a military escalation, but from a speech. Trump, speaking to supporters and later to international media, described the current state of U.S. Iran tensions as a situation where America holds all the cards and where Iran is, quote, desperate for a deal. That framing was not just inaccurate in Tehran's view. It was, according to Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei, a deliberate attempt to manufacture a false narrative of American strength at a moment when the actual diplomatic record tells a very different story. Here is the full context of what has been building beneath the surface. For the past year and a half, the United States and Iran have been engaged in what diplomats carefully describe as indirect talks, meaning neither side officially admits they are negotiating, while both sides quietly send messages through intermediaries in Oman, Qatar, and occasionally through European back channel contacts. This structure exists because direct negotiation carries enormous domestic political cost for both governments. Trump cannot be seen negotiating with a regime he has spent years calling the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Iran's supreme leader cannot be seen bowing to American pressure after decades of building an ideological identity around resistance to what Tehran calls Western imperialism. But here is where the geopolitical reality gets genuinely complicated. Iran is not negotiating from a position of collapse. Yes, the economy has suffered enormously under sanctions. Yes, the Iranian rial has lost dramatic value. Yes, ordinary Iranians are paying the price for their government's decisions. All of that is true. But Iran has also spent the past decade methodically building what military analysts call a forward defense strategy, which means instead of waiting for threats to reach Iranian soil, Tehran has extended its influence across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen through a network of aligned militias and political movements that collectively form what is now commonly called the axis of resistance. Dismantling that network is not something a diplomatic agreement can accomplish overnight, and Iran's leadership knows that, which is why when Trump frames the situation as America holding all the cards, uh, Iranian officials view that framing not as confident diplomacy, but as a misreading of the actual strategic landscape that demands a public correction. Everything escalated on the specific day that Trump's team floated what they described internally as a framework proposal, suggesting Iran would receive partial sanctions relief in exchange for capping uranium enrichment at a level below weapons grade, agreeing to more intrusive international inspections, and publicly committing to not sharing missile technology with regional partners. The Iranian response, delivered not through a quiet diplomatic rejection, but through a formal press conference broadcast on state television, was withering. Senior advisor to the Supreme Leader, Ali Shamkhani, told reporters that Iran had reviewed what was being described as an American offer and found it to be, in his exact words, not a proposal, but an ultimatum wrapped in the language of negotiation. He said Tehran had seen this pattern before and that history had consistently proven that yielding to such pressure only invites more pressure. And then came the phrase that started reverberating through every foreign ministry and think tank from London to Beijing: don't call defeat a deal. It came from a source close to Iran's negotiating team speaking to regional media, but it was quickly amplified and endorsed by official Iranian government channels. The full context of the statement was this: if the United States walks away from genuine diplomacy, retreats from its own commitments under previous frameworks, imposes maximum pressure, and then expects the other side to accept diminished terms as a face-saving arrangement, that is not a deal. That is defeat being rebranded. And Iran's message to Trump was direct: they will not participate in the rebranding. Smash that like button right now if this is starting to make sense, because the deeper you go into this, the more you realize that what is happening between the US and Iran is not just about nuclear enrichment percentages or sanctions relief packages. It is about who controls the narrative of this confrontation and what that narrative means for American credibility across the entire region. To understand why Iran's public rebuke landed with such force, you have to understand the historical architecture of US Iran relations and why every move in this chess game carries the weight of decades. In 2015, after years of painful multilateral negotiations, the Obama administration and 5 other world powers reached the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the JCPOA, with Iran. Under that agreement, Iran agreed to significant limits on its nuclear program in exchange for sweeping sanctions relief. International inspectors verified Iranian compliance. The deal was not perfect, and critics had legitimate concerns about sunset clauses and ballistic missile provisions, but it was functioning. Then in 2018, Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement entirely, reimposed sanctions, and launched what his administration called a maximum pressure campaign designed to force Iran back to the table to negotiate what Trump described as a better deal. Iran's response was to gradually and publicly exceed the enrichment limits set by the JCPOA, essentially telling the world that if the US was not going to honor the deal, Iran saw no reason to be bound by it either. Here is why that history matters directly to what is happening now. When Trump says Iran is desperate for a deal and that America holds all the cards, Iranian officials are not just disagreeing on the facts. They are pointing to a specific recent history in which the United States made commitments, then walked away from those commitments, and is now asking Iran to make new commitments with no credible guarantee that the next American administration will honor them either. The Iranian argument, stated plainly, is this: why would we accept a weaker deal from an administration that already broke a stronger one? Legal and foreign policy scholars are taking this question seriously. Dr. Vali Nazar, professor of international affairs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a former State Department senior advisor, told Foreign Policy magazine that the structural problem in U.S. Iran diplomacy is that the American political system makes long-term commitments nearly impossible to sustain because each new administration can simply reverse the previous one's foreign policy. He noted that this creates a credibility deficit that no single negotiation can resolve on its own. Former British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt speaking at a Council on Foreign Relations event in London, made the point even more directly, observing that America's allies in Europe who co signed the original nuclear deal were never fully consulted before Trump's 2018 withdrawal, and that rebuilding confidence in American diplomatic commitments would require more than just a new agreement. It would require a demonstrated track record of honoring them. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people who are trying to understand what is actually happening in the world right now. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is not without its own strategic logic, and it would be intellectually dishonest to ignore it. The argument from Trump's team is essentially this. The original JCPOA was structurally weak because it was time limited. It did not address Iran's ballistic missile development, and it did not constrain Iran's behavior across the region. All of those criticisms have merit. Iran has continued developing missiles capable of reaching Israel, Saudi Arabia, and U.S. military bases. Iranian-backed groups have attacked American assets in Iraq and Syria. Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful regional proxy, has drawn Israel into a devastating conflict in Lebanon. The Trump team's position is that a deal which only addresses nuclear enrichment while leaving all of these other issues untouched is not a deal that makes America or its allies genuinely safer. The problem, as critics of the maximum pressure strategy point out, is that walking away from the nuclear deal did not stop any of those other activities. Iran's missiles are more advanced today than they were in 2018. Iranian regional influence has expanded, not contracted, and Iran's nuclear enrichment has accelerated dramatically, going from the 3.67% limit set by the JCPOA to levels now exceeding 60%, which puts Iran closer to weapons grade material than at any previous point in its history. So the honest assessment, acknowledged even by some figures within the national security establishment who are broadly sympathetic to the maximum pressure approach, is that the strategy has inflicted real economic pain on Iran without achieving its stated strategic objectives. That is the uncomfortable reality sitting at the center of this confrontation. And it is precisely that reality that Iran's "don't call defeat a deal" statement is pointing to. Now, here is where the geopolitical implications extend far beyond just the US and Iran and begin to affect the entire structure of international relations. China and Russia have both been carefully watching this confrontation and not as neutral observers. China has significantly deepened its economic relationship with Iran over the past several years, absorbing a substantial portion of Iranian oil exports despite American sanctions, effectively providing Tehran with an economic lifeline that limits the actual coercive power of those sanctions. In March 2023, China brokered a diplomatic normalization agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia that stunned Washington analysts who had assumed that level of regional diplomacy was either American-led or simply not happening. The fact that Beijing successfully positioned itself as a neutral power broker in a region where America had long claimed dominant influence was, according to multiple foreign policy analysts, a significant shift in the geopolitical landscape. Russia, for its part, has deepened military cooperation with Iran, including confirmed transfers of Russian air defense systems to Tehran, and according to Western intelligence assessments, potential Iranian provision of drones and munitions to Russian forces operating in Ukraine. These are not coincidental developments. They are part of a deliberate effort by Iran, Russia, and China to construct an alternative international architecture that reduces the effectiveness of American unilateral sanctions and diplomatic pressure. When Trump says America holds all the cards, Iranian officials are essentially responding that the deck has been reshuffled. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. Here is what the next critical phase of this confrontation looks like and what to watch for. The immediate pressure point is Iran's nuclear timeline. International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors have reported that Iran has accumulated enough highly enriched uranium that, with additional technical steps, could theoretically be converted toward weapons grade material. Most independent analysts place Iran's technical breakout timeline, meaning the time needed to produce enough fissile material for a single nuclear device, at somewhere between a few weeks and several months, though building an actual deliverable weapon would take considerably longer. This creates a genuine urgency in Washington and among American allies, particularly Israel, which has explicitly stated that it will not allow Iran to cross the threshold of nuclear weapons capability. At the same time, Iran's domestic politics are shifting in ways that make diplomacy more complicated. The reformist president, Masoud Pezeshkian, who was elected in 2024 on a platform that included signaling openness to diplomacy with the West, has been navigating extraordinarily difficult terrain between Iran's hardline establishment, which remains deeply skeptical of any agreement with America, and a population that is genuinely exhausted by economic hardship. Every time Trump publicly frames the negotiations in terms that sound like Iranian humiliation, it strengthens the hand of Iranian hardliners who've been arguing all along that America cannot be trusted and that compromise is weakness. In this sense, Trump's rhetorical framing is not just diplomatically counterproductive, it is strategically self-defeating because it makes the Iranian interlocutors who might actually be willing to negotiate less, not more, able to do so. Keep a very close eye on three specific upcoming developments. First, the next IAEA quarterly report on Iranian nuclear activities, which will give the clearest current picture of exactly how far Iran's enrichment program has progressed and how much room there is for a diplomatic resolution before the situation reaches a genuinely irreversible threshold. Second, the state of play in indirect talks through Oman, which multiple regional sources indicate have not completely collapsed, but are operating at a level of minimal trust that makes any breakthrough extremely difficult. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the internal politics within the Israeli government regarding when and whether to pursue unilateral military action against Iranian nuclear facilities, a step that could change the entire equation overnight, regardless of where the U.S. Iran diplomatic track stands. Before we go any further, make sure you are subscribed right now because this story is developing fast and every development in the next several weeks is going to matter enormously. Here is where things stand right now. Stated plainly, Iran has publicly and directly told the Trump administration that it sees through the narrative being constructed around these negotiations. The phrase "don't call defeat a deal" is not just a rhetorical flourish. It is a signal to the broader international community, to China, to Russia, to the global South, to America's own European allies, that Tehran views the current American approach as a manufactured pressure campaign rather than a genuine diplomatic offer. That signal is being received. European diplomats privately acknowledge that America's credibility as a reliable negotiating partner took a serious hit when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, and that rebuilding that credibility requires more than tough talk. At the same time, the stakes could not be higher. An Iran that crosses the nuclear threshold changes the security architecture of the entire Middle East permanently. Saudi Arabia has already signaled that it would seek its own nuclear capability if Iran acquires one. Egypt has made similar statements. The proliferation consequences of a failed diplomatic track are, as multiple nonproliferation experts have warned, potentially catastrophic and irreversible. This is not just about Iran and America. This is about whether the international system for managing nuclear weapons, already under extraordinary stress from events in Ukraine and North Korea, can hold together at all. The evidence is out there, the statements have been made, the historical record is clear, and now the world is watching to see whether genuine diplomacy is still possible or whether we are heading toward a confrontation whose consequences no one in Washington, Tehran, or anywhere else can fully predict or control. The stakes have never been higher. The window for a diplomatic resolution has never been narrower. And the don't call defeat a deal challenge from Iran has never been more pointed. Pause for a second right now and hit that like button if you found value in this breakdown. And if you want to understand the real geopolitics driving the stories that actually shape our world, subscribe immediately because this is exactly the kind of deep analysis you are going to need in the weeks and months ahead. This story is far from over.